Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Goodcast. That is Mr. Goody's podcast. Today's story is going to be called Frozen, and it has nothing to do with the Disney movie. And it's kind of ironic, I say Frozen and there's fire in the background. Okay, I'm going to set the scene for you. The story begins in a dirt road holler in a country setting far back in the woods, up on a hill during the winter months. It involves a shack that was built with lumber that had floated in from a flood from the 1930s, and the foundation was made out of limestone. There was no running water. There was junk cars in the yard that had been collected over the years. There were many dogs and animals outside the shack and also inside the shack. The shack will appear in future podcast episodes, and I will get to the origin of the shack. But in this episode, we're going to be focused on the other story. I'm just telling you where it's taking place, and it's taking place in that shack. This story takes place in April of 1996. I have changed all of these characters' names to protect privacy, but this is based on a true story. There was an old man. We'll call him Grandpa. Why not? We'll call him Gramps. And there was his daughter. We'll call her Donna. Okay? So, and we'll call the son Brandon. Okay, so we have Gramps, Donna, and her son Brandon. Okay, one evening out of nowhere, Donna and Brandon hadn't been to the shack in many years. In fact, they started to live their own lives. It's not that they didn't love their grandpa or their grandma. It's just they started to live their own lives away from there. And the Gramps and Grandma had a kind of, how do we put this? A hoarding habit that was very, very bad. They would hoard everything from milk jugs to garbage, TV guides, old refrigerators, lawnmowers, old cars, you name it. If you can think of it, it was there. And it had been piled up for years and years. Probably about 40 years worth of hoarding. And once you make your way through all of that, you get to the shack. Well, years prior, Donna had moved away from her father's house when she had got married. And she still loved her parents very much, but she hardly ever visited them because of, that situation, the hoarding situation, and all of the cats and dogs. There must have been, 40-something dogs and maybe even more cats. And they ranged from being in these cars that had been on the land, inside of the cars, and they would be fed through the windows. Some of them may be in cages, dog pens, just all over on the property, kept in different ways, and some of the animals had never seen each other. Some of the animals had been ran over by cars and they were half maimed. There was a one-eyed cat who had been ran over and it kind of needed a patch because it was kind of scary because you could see its eye socket. But other than that, it was healthy. There was a three-legged dog, and it could run just as fast as a four-legged dog. I mean, it's really sad stuff. I mean, I really don't know how to gingerly put that. But anyways, so it had been years since we had seen Gramps. And in April of 96, we get a knock at the door saying that one of Gramps' kids is very ill. And that would be Donna's brother. We'll call him Richard. Richard wasn't all the way there mentally. He didn't have all of his mental faculties. So he was never going to move away from home. He was always there, living with his parents. And he was always doing chores for them, like getting coal. That's how they heated in that little shack, was an old potbelly stove that burnt coal. And for those of you that don't know what that is or can't picture it, you can look that up on Google. You can Google it. And that winter had been particularly bitter, cold. It was below zero, and it was very, very bitter. So Gramps had come knocking on the door in April, and by April it's springtime. And he never ever said that anyone was sick before. He didn't like the doctors. He really didn't believe in the doctors. He thought doctors were bad and that he could just take care of everything himself. He was a mountain man. In fact, a lot of people gave him the nickname of William Hill, which in turn means hillbilly. But he took that in pride because he loved being a man of the land, or so he thought. Anyways, he came and he knocked on the door and he said that Richard was sick. He was like, "Donna, Richard is sick. I think he has the flu. Can you come and check on him?" And Donna and her son, Brandon, went and drove out to the holler, which was about 10 miles away, to go check to see how Richard was doing. And they had feared the worst. Brandon was 16 at the time. And, of course, Donna, his mother, was in her late 30s. And Richard, her brother, was around 40 years old. And Donna drove up the dirt road, and you could hear the gravels. It had been a long time since she had heard the gravels. And she drove up out into the country and then up on the hill, and she parked in the driveway. And there she saw the shack, the place that she had lived when she was born. That is where she had grown up. And Brandon had known that Gramps would never have said anybody was sick. So Brandon tells his mom, Donna, said, "I think Richard may be close to death, because Gramps never says anyone is sick. So Brandon wants to go into the house first. The door is closed, and he doesn't want to frighten his mom. Even though he's 16, he wants to be a man, or what he thinks is a man. He doesn't want his mom to be scared of what's behind that door. Donna agrees to let Brandon go to the door. And as Brandon goes closer to the door, he can smell a smell that he's never smelled before. And he has smelled, dead animals, some pretty foul smells before, but nothing quite like that. And the closer he got to the door, the stronger it was. It almost made him trigger his gag reflex. He almost could not go in without his gag reflex triggering. But he went inside and looked straight forward. Didn't see anyone at first. And then he looked to the right slowly, and then he looked down. And that's when he saw his Uncle Richard laying in a blanket like this, and sitting in a chair, and him going like this, shaking. And Brandon calls out to Richard and said, "I'm here to help you." He said, "You ready for me to help you?" And Richard goes, "Uh-huh." Richard could barely even speak. It looked like Richard hadn't had a haircut or a bath or anything for months, if not longer. I mean, his hair, probably years. The bath, probably months. He was very, very malnourished and starved. He had a 6'1" height frame, and it would later be determined that he weighed 76 pounds. He was almost skin and bone. And Brandon couldn't see exactly where the injuries were or what was wrong with Richard at first. But then he noticed that there was blankets covering the bottom half of Richard. And he knew that he was going to have to take those covers and pull them back. He slowly grabs the covers and moves them back. And what he sees next is chilling. In fact, if you don't want to hear farther, then you need to pause the video and just end it here, because it is pretty graphic. Okay, you've been warned. Okay, here it goes. Underneath the blanket, starting at about midways down the thigh, Brandon could see frostbite, that Richard had been frostbitten, and gangrene, infection, sepsis. The legs looked like they were mummified. Once you got past the knees, he could see actual bones in the leg and in the feet. And the feet were actually frozen to the ground. And that horrible stench, that rotten smell that had smelled different than anything that's ever been dead before, was the smell of that rotting flesh that had been frostbitten and frozen, and the infection running through Richard's body as he lay there wasting away. Brandon immediately doesn't want to alarm his mom, Donna, and says, "Mom, it's worse. It's worse than I thought, but we have got to get him help. We have to get your brother help." And Gramps wasn't in his right mind. He thought he was going to get in trouble. Granted, he didn't know what kind of trouble because his mind wasn't all there. He just knew that there was going to be trouble. So he threatens everybody that they better not call an ambulance. So Brandon said, "We have to get him there no matter what." So he decides to take them in Gramps' station wagon. He clears all the junk, and there was a lot of junk in Gramps' station wagon, and got some plywood and made a stretcher as best as he could. And one of Brandon's other uncles was home at the time, so he got help as he was going to carry Richard out on a stretcher. As he got inside, Brandon was kind of scared but strong. He knew that he had to do this. He had to get Richard out because he didn't know how long Richard would have left, and that he looked pretty bad off. It looked like he was almost going to go into shock. So he goes in and he tries to gingerly, softly put his arms underneath of Richard, and he says, "Hold on, buddy. Hold on. I'm here to help you." And Richard goes, "Uh-huh." Like he acknowledged him and he wanted him to help him. And then he puts his arms under his underarms and holds him and tries to lift him up. As he does that, he feels how light that Richard really is, being at 76 pounds. He doesn't know it's 76 pounds yet, but he knows he's razor thin with as far as his weight goes. And as he's picking Richard up, all of a sudden he feels something tugging. And when he looks down, he sees that Richard's feet are frozen to the floor. And there is no running water in this shack. None at all. No running water. So there is a barrel that is used to catch rain outside of this shack. And that rainwater is all that there was. And there was a bowl that they used to feed the animals. And Brandon grabbed that bowl and poured it over Richard's feet so it would melt the ice. This was not hot water. It was not cold water. It was lukewarm water. And it melted that ice so that Brandon could lift Richard up. And it was working. But as he was lifting Richard up on his right foot, around the heel of his right foot, part of it just came off where it was so rotten and frostbitten. And it was just there. He then was carrying Richard in his arms and laid him on the plywood that was now the stretcher. He then, with his other uncle, carried Richard down to the station wagon, loaded him up, and his grandpa was driving, and they drove straight to the hospital. It probably took about 18 minutes to get to the hospital, but it seemed like much longer because there were so many racing thoughts going through Brandon's head. He was thinking, oh my gosh, is he going to die? But all of this he had to keep in his mind because he didn't want to alert anybody or want anybody to feel like they were alarmed. He just wanted to get things done quickly and best as possible. So, as soon as he gets to the ER, he has his Gramps pull into the ER drop off. Brandon walks in and says there's an extreme emergency outside. And because of him being 16, he thought that everybody would think it was a prank, but in fact, he was not pranking. He said, we're going to need a stretcher outside and all the doctors that are not working on an emergency to come out and help, and that he would explain the story later. And they listened to him. They brought the stretcher, and all the doctors started surrounding the station wagon. And then Gramps gets out of the car wearing a slush puppy toboggan with a little cotton ball on top of it. And he smiles from ear to ear with a crooked hillbilly smile. And he's hard of hearing, and he goes, yeah, I think he's got the flu. And then he looks at another doctor and says, yeah, my car's fast. It can hit 65 or 70 when I really open her up. And they kept asking him where this man has been, to be in this bad a shape. Where has this man been? Talking about Richard. So Brandon starts telling them, filling them in the story that he had found out that Richard had been collecting coal and everything during this frigid winter, and his shoes, he hadn't had a new pair of shoes in years, at least 5 years, and these shoes were worn out and had holes in them. And that's how it all started. That's how Richard had got frostbitten, and then his feet started to bust open and he became immobile and he couldn't really move. And they fed him a little bit, but as he became immobile, they just let him sit there with that frostbite, and how it turned into gangrene and how it started traveling up his legs. And he had just sat there all of that time for months, since way back in the winter, and he deteriorated to that. And the hospital had said that was the worst case that they had ever seen. And for a while, at least 3 to 4 days, they didn't even know if Richard would live. But after the 4th day, they kept doing surgeries to find out where the living tissue is. At first, they amputated the toes. There was no sign of blood flow. Then they go a little farther, up above the ankle, no blood flow. Then they go to the shin, no blood flow. Finally, right below the knee, that is where there was blood flow. and that is where the amputated on both sides is just right below the knee. And then there were also other sores because he had also sat there and lay in his own urine and feces for all of those months too. It was a miracle that he was going to live. And I think that is where I'm going to end the first part of the Frozen story, because there's just so much to it, and I don't want to make like an hour-long podcast. So I'm going to leave it right here for now. And you guys tell me what you think. Now, this is a true story. It actually happened. Just leave your comments in the comment section below. Tell me what you think. I greatly appreciate it. And if you can, hit that subscribe button and hit that bell. And I greatly appreciate you spending your time here watching this video with this old guy. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.